All right, so here's our last video on World War II. So this is College Board Topic 714, Post-War Diplomacy. So this is all about what happens at the end of the war. So in our previous videos, we talked about interwar diplomacy, or the diplomacy of the United States between the two world wars, and that led us up to the beginning of World War II. Where we looked at a video on mobilization of the U.S. economy and society to fight war. We looked at the military aspect of World War II in the United States. So now this final video is on post-war diplomacy. So what are the causes or consequences of U.S. involvement in World War II? Sorry, not causes, but consequences. So your learning objective in this one, and this is going to be a pretty short video, is to be able to explain the consequences of U.S. involvement in World War II. So there's only one big historical development or idea that that applies to this topic that the College Board wants you to know. So the historical development is that the war-ravaged condition of Asia and Europe and the dominant role of the United States in the Allied victory and post-war peace settlement allowed the United States to emerge from the war as the most powerful nation on earth. So at the end of World War II, the United States is, without a doubt, without any kind of controversy or challenger, the United States is the most powerful nation on earth. Okay, there's a few reasons for this, so we're going to take a look at that. But remember, we're looking at what are the consequences of U.S. involvement in World War II. The consequence is the United States becomes the most powerful nation on earth. Okay, so one of the important aspects or things during the war that play into this historical development are the wartime conferences. So I mentioned all of these in the previous video on topic 713, but just a quick review. There was the first conference in Casablanca, which was January 1943. This was just Roosevelt and Churchill. Stalin was not a part of this one yet. This is where they decided to invade northern Africa and use that as a jumping point into Italy. Tehran in 1943, the big three with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And in Tehran, this is where the Allies agreed to liberate France, and the Soviets agree that they will join the war against Japan eventually, but no date is set. Okay, Yalta Conference, the most important of the conferences, most significant historically. This was the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And this was the conference where the Soviet Union set their date that they would join the war with Japan on August 8th of 1945 if the war had not ended at that point. Right, so this is the most significant of those, and this is where we're really starting to see the rift between the Soviet Union and their communist ideology emerge. There's a rift between the Soviet Union and the other Western nations. Okay, and then the final conference was Potsdam, and this was Truman, not Roosevelt, right? So President Truman. And then during this conference, a new British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, was in attendance. And this was the conference where the leaders are meeting to decide post-war details. So let's take a look at what these post-war details ended up being. Okay, but the big idea is that successively through these conferences, the tensions of the coming Cold War are emerging. Okay, so right here pictured, we have U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, who was the Supreme Commander of the Pacific, Supreme Allied Commander of the Pacific for the United States. He oversaw the occupying forces of Japan post-war. So the actions of the United States, and in Japan, it was really just the United States that was able to control these peace conferences, because none of the other nations had fought in this portion of World War II. So there were war crime trials in Tokyo where war criminals were put on on trial, and many of them were executed for the wartime atrocities they committed. The Japanese military was dismantled after World War II, and Japan was left with just a defensive force. And there was a promise on the part of the United States to make sure that nations in Asia did not take over Japan while it was weak post-war. And Japan was made to transform their economy into capitalism. They also were, as a nation, Japan adopted a new constitution, and the emperor status in Japan was downgraded to that of a figurehead. Prior to this, the emperor in Japan was viewed almost as a demigod. So the emperor was downgraded to figurehead, and political power was put into a parliamentary system. So there were moves to try to make Japan more democratic and less authoritarian after World War II. The U.S. left Japan in 1951. So U.S. occupation ended in 1951. And following World War II, there is still resentment. That issue of the atomic bomb is still very thorny, but Japan and the United States are strong economic allies, if nothing else. In Germany, and these were the agreements that were made in the Potsdam Conference. In Germany, it was decided that the nation of Germany would be divided into 4 administration zones. So after the war, as Germany was recovering, the Allied nations would administer different zones of Germany. And then the city of Berlin was also divided into administration zones. So you can see on this map, we have these 4 zones of Germany, right? Or, kind of quadrants of Germany. The United States was in charge of administering the Southeast zone. The Soviet Union had the Northeast zone, Britain, Northwest, and then France, the Southwest, sorry. And then in Berlin, you can see that the city of Berlin itself, which is pictured right here, deep inside of the Soviet territory, the city of Berlin itself was also divided into occupation zones. So what happens, and then also the Nuremberg trials. So there were trials of Nazi officials. They were tried as war criminals in the city of Nuremberg. 24 were tried as war criminals. Half of those 24 were sentenced to death by hanging. And this was an Allied cooperation, a move to cooperation in the peace process. So what happens in the longer term in Germany is this division of Germany occurs, is that the Soviet Union maintains control of its region of Germany, which became called, when I was a kid, we called this East Germany. And then the other 3 countries, Germany was reunited and given back political control over time, and that was West Germany, or part of the free world. And then the Soviet Union maintained control of the Eastern, you can see my mouse moving here, the Eastern European nations that they occupied during World War II, and puppet governments, or governments friendly to the Soviet government, were put in place in those regions or in those countries. And this line that we see here becomes called the Iron Curtain. And so this takes a little while to develop. It develops in the years and almost decade after World War II, but the Iron Curtain becomes the physical boundary between communism, these red nations that are communist nations, and free democratic and capitalistic nations, free market nations in blue. And this is really, if we're looking at this line between these two, this is, it's a symbol of the physical boundary between these two ideologies, but this is really what becomes a characteristic of foreign policy in the late 1900s, or late 1900s. This is this fight between communism and free market systems. Okay, so when we're looking at legacies of World War II, This is U.S. heavy because this is a U.S. history course, but World War II as a whole was the most destructive war in the history of the world. So, in terms of cities lost, buildings lost, infrastructure lost, and also lives lost, this is the most destructive war in human history. Okay, the United Nations is established as a term or a condition of the ending of this war, but this time the United States joined the United Nations. So after World War One, the League of Nations, the United States didn't join, and that really hampered or hindered the ability of the League of Nations to be a peacekeeping organization. After World War II, the U.S. Congress accepted the role as world power or leader of the world. So the U.S. Joins this United Nations, and it's still operating today. In 1945, the U.S. is at the same time the most powerful nation and the most prosperous nation in the world. So, in terms of power, the U.S. is the only nation in 1945 with the atomic bomb. And so that will be the case for 4 years. From 1945 to 1949, the United States is the only nation with atomic bomb. So it is the most powerful. And in terms of prosperity, the United States economy became very, very robust during World War II because of all the World War II manufacturing. So at the same time in 1945, most powerful and most prosperous nation. People look forward to the ending of this war in the United States with a lot of optimism. For the first time, if you think about the people who were young adults, so in their 20s and 30s, these people lived through the Great Depression and then World War II. So this is the first time in their lives that they really are looking forward with a lot of optimism to a period of prosperity and peace and stability. But there's a specter of communism and atomic warfare kind of hanging over the United States, because by 1949, the Soviet Union will develop its own atomic bomb. And then we enter a period of time where both nations are on the edge of warfare. And there's this question of whether there will be a kind of nuclear annihilation in the war, or in the world, sorry. Okay, so if we review back, it's pretty easy historical development for this topic, right? The United States emerges as the most powerful nation on earth. And that's our topic for post-war diplomacy. So if we look back on World War II and the topics we looked at, right? There was interwar foreign policy. So for interwar foreign policy, you want to be able to explain similarities and differences about the people's attitudes in the nation's proper role in the world. So, should the United States be involved in world politics, or should the United States be more isolated? And if you remember, the United States progressed from disengagement or non-involvement in foreign policy in the troubles of Europe to neutrality to total involvement with interwar foreign policy. Okay, the second topic was mobilization. So this mass mobilization of the economy, rationing, wartime production, women in the workforce, African Americans in the Great Migration, guest workers from Mexico, the braceros, and Japanese internment were all part of mobilization. So those are big issues with mobilization. For military, you're really looking at why were the Allies successful in World War II. So we see that there's a feeling of purpose on the part of the American people. They feel like this is a fight for the survival of freedom and democracy. There's a lot of Allied cooperation. So militarily, the Allies are successful because of things like those wartime conferences and D-Day and technological advancements like the atomic bomb. And then the last one that we just went through was post-war diplomacy. The United States emerges as the most powerful nation on earth, both economically and militarily, at the end of World War II. So this is the end of time period 7. This was the last topic we need to cover for that time period. As you move into time period 8 and the second half of the 20th century, in terms of foreign policy, we look at long-term effects of World War II. It really is the emergence of the Cold War. So this is that turning point where the United States steps onto the stage as a world leader of what we call the free world. And then there is this constant tension with the Soviet Union, who is the leader of the communist world. So any questions on this topic at all, please send a message and let me know. And this finishes up our study of World War II.